So, I was gonna do a video about Trump's interview with Sid the Sloth. And of course, by Sid the Sloth, I mean Candace Owens, who appears to have suffered from hypertelorism, or still does. But I realize that there are plenty of people who are gonna cover the very obvious things in that interview. I mean, I could say one or two things about it, like I can talk about the things that weren't said in that interview. Like, in that interview, there was no mention of Ashley Babbitt. There was no mention of all the promises that Trump broke. There was no mention of Trump assassinating the head of the Iranian military for absolutely no reason and then lying about it until it eventually came out that actually, no, in fact, they assassinated this guy for no reason because they were trying to start a hot war with Iran. And the only reason why we didn't get into a hot war with Iran is because I guess the Iranian leaders aren't as stupid as many other of the leaders of the world. So I was going to mention some of that, but I was like, nah, you know what? There are plenty of people who are going to be covering that. Maybe they didn't cover those things that I mentioned. Maybe they didn't cover Candace's obvious hypertelorism. But regardless, I felt like it was irrelevant for me to discuss that interview. So instead, I decided that I should just kind of post this excerpt from one of my early videos. This is an excerpt from part 1 of my The Club Uncensored documentary, which can be found in my playlist, The Club Uncensored. And this is a very important excerpt because it's something that a lot of people don't know about Donald Trump. And that is that his family has been connected to the club for over 1,000 years. Trump didn't join the club. Trump was born into the club. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are also related. And this was actually going to be the original purpose of this documentary. This documentary was originally a video called A Pessimistic Trump Prediction. And in that video, I was going to make a pessimistic prediction about Donald Trump's presidency based off of this information that he is related to Hillary Clinton. But then, before I knew it, I found myself in a rabbit hole that went all the way back to the beginning of civilization. But before I go dragging you back to the beginning of civilization, let's go over one or two more people that Donald Trump is related to. Like the Heinz ketchup family. That's right, Donald Trump and the Heinz ketchup family are related. And there was even an interesting film done about it, entitled Kings of Kalistat. And the film is subtitled My Village, Ketchup, and the King of New York. Which is actually a proper title, because not only is Donald Trump and all of the presidents related to royalty on one side of his family, but on his other side of the family, on his mother's side of the family, Donald Trump can also trace his bloodline all the way back to Godred the Black King of Man and the Isles. And who is this Godred the Black King of Man and the Isles? Well, this Godred is our next clue. He's our next point down the world's greatest family tree. So the Black King can be found in Wikipedia under the name Godred Crovan. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things about Godred Crovan. I don't want to spend too much time on him because this documentary is going to be long enough as it is. So a few interesting things about Godred Crovan. One, his precise parentage is uncertain, although some believe that he is probably a descendant of a king of Dublin. That's not very important. What is important is that Godred Crovan actually wasn't a king. He actually violently seized the kingship from somebody else. Another interesting thing about Godred is Godred's greatest impact on history, which according to Wikipedia may have been his founding of the Crovan Dynasty. His descendants ruled the Isles for almost 2 centuries. And Godred was an important maternal ancestor of Clan Somerley, a family that held power in the Isles centuries after the final extinction of the Crovan dynasty. So right off the bat, it's very interesting to note that Godred's family, or at least his ancestors, controlled this area for centuries. Doesn't really say for how many centuries. His main family controlled it for 2 centuries, so that's almost 200 years. And then the family after that, which is still his family, it's just like his family who married off to another family and assumed another name. So they were in control for centuries after the final extinction of the Crovan dynasty. It doesn't even say how many centuries. For centuries can be up to today, but that's neither here or there. So the other interesting thing that it says about Godred here links him to these other possible names. It says that he could be this one guy who this one family claims is their ancestor. It also says that he could be identical to the celebrated King Ori of Manx legend. He could be this king that is talked about in a legend, and this king is traditionally credited with instituting the Manx legal system. Godred and King Ori are associated with numerous historic and prehistoric sites on Man and the Isles. And we're going to talk about some of those historic and prehistoric sites that they're associated with in 1 second. First, I just want to comment on this Manx legal system that he might be associated with, or he might be credited with. So this Manx legal system is essentially a legal system very similar to the English legal system of common law, and that's common law with a lowercase c, not an uppercase c. Going back to these prehistoric sites that he's related to, we're going to delay getting to them in 1 second because they're related to where Godred got his power from. And according to Wikipedia, Godred's power base may have been located in the Hebrides. Now, what are the Hebrides? I'm sure many of you are asking. Sounds a lot like Hebrews. Maybe we'll connect those two later on. For now, let's talk about the Hebrides. The Hebrides are actually our next connection down the family tree, but we're not going to follow through with this connection. Let's just talk briefly about the Hebrides. So the Hebrides have an interesting history. These islands have a long history of occupation dating back to the Mesolithic period, around 6,500 BC. That's like 8,500 years ago. That's pretty far back, before ancient Egypt or around the establishing of ancient Egypt. Very important, because remember, this documentary will be going back to the beginning of civilization. So, the prehistory on this island. So it goes all the way back to 8,500 years ago. So there's an interesting thing on this archipelago. So there's a Bronze Age settlement on one of the southern the Hebrides, and it's the only place in the United Kingdom where prehistoric mummies have been found. That's right, prehistoric mummies. Mummies as in ancient Egypt. Remember, we will be finding our way back to the beginning of civilization, to ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. These prehistoric mummies, they were found in Clad Helen. These mummies are very interesting. A male who may have died around circa 1600 BC, and another, a female who died circa 1300 BC, about the same time as King Tutankhamun, or King Tut, of Egypt. Remember, ancient Egypt, we will be finding our way back there. Just not quite yet. So, there's some interesting things about these mummies. Some believe that they not only date back to the times of ancient Egypt, but some believe that they actually may have even been brought from ancient Egypt. These mummies are composed of different human remains, almost like they were put together. It's almost as if it was a human being who had gone through certain organ donating or certain... It's very odd, let's just say that. I advise people to go and read up on these mummies. So another thing can be found on this island, actually, and is the Kalanish stones. And these Kalanish stones are standing stones that are even older than Stonehenge. And it's funny because they're further north, too, so you would think that Stonehenge would have been built before them. Anyway, so these stones were prehistoric lunar observatory. Others have proposed a relationship between the stones, the moon, and the Clesham range on Harris. I didn't look up that range, to be honest with you. But this is actually one of the prehistoric sites that Godred is related to. There's some mention of him on these stones. The only thing I want people to recognize is that it is a moon observatory, and that it's very old. And actually, there is one other interesting thing about these islands, and it comes from a legend. Actually, it comes from a tale. And it was a tale about an expedition to the west coast of Scotland in shortly before AD 83. And this person stated it was a gloomy journey amongst uninhabited islands, but this person had visited one in which was the retreat of holy men. He mentioned neither the Druids nor the name of the island, and the Druids were the holy men in the area. So it's essentially a story of this guy who went in the direction of the Hebrides, where the Hebrides in this area, this moon observatory, should have been, and he mentions that it was a retreat of holy men. This is all going to be very important. And to further link the Hebrides and northern Scotland with ancient Egypt, I present to you this article entitled Going Underground, the massive European network of Stone Age tunnels that weaves from Scotland to Turkey. And actually, these tunnels weave all the way down to Egypt, northern Africa. So it's just a very interesting article. Of course, it's not one long tunnel. It's a series of tunnels that are somewhat intermeshed. You know, you can walk from one tunnel system to another, and you could theoretically do the whole journey going in and out of tunnels every so often. And it's interesting. These tunnels, they're very old, so it's very likely that other parts of this tunnel network have already collapsed. So it's very likely that this tunnel system was much more complex and probably much longer, or probably much more intermeshed than it is today. And essentially, I'm just presenting this because to me it shows that there was some connection between Scotland and North Africa. There was a group of people using a hidden system of tunnels, and it's very interesting because nobody really knows what these tunnels are for. They speculate that it was for bad weather, like traveling during bad weather. Some other people say it's to avoid like predators. I think that they're both wrong. If you look at this lady in the tunnel, one of the characteristics of this network of tunnels is that it's very tight. There's only enough room to wiggle along, it says. And as you can see from this girl, this is a small female, there is not a lot of room to travel through these tunnels. Okay, these are not tunnels for a lot of people to be traveling through when the weather's bad. And it's not used for people to travel to avoid predators. To me, they're secret tunnels. I believe that they're are meant to not arouse suspicion. They're tunnels that are designed in such a way that if other people who are not aware of what they are stumble across them, they won't be able to navigate them. Or at least they won't be able to easily navigate them. It'll deter people who are foreign to these tunnels or who are not wholly familiar with these tunnels. And more evidence to lend credence to my hypothesis that these tunnels are in fact secret tunnels can be found in the stories about these tunnels and the fact that churches and chapels were often built by the entrances of these tunnels. So in some cases there have been writings discovered that refer to these tunnels as gateways to the underworld. And apparently, according to this article, and I disagree with this, the churches and chapels were built at the entranceways of these tunnels, perhaps because the churches were afraid of the heathen legacy the tunnels might have represented. I think that these stories relating these tunnels to the underworld was a way to further deter people from these tunnels. And I think that this idea or this hypothesis that the church built their chapels and churches at the entrances of these tunnels because they were afraid of some heathen legacy also has some truth to it. However, I think that the truth that is hidden here is far from what they are trying to lead us to believe. I think that the church built chapels and churches by the entrances of these tunnels to further guard these tunnels. You can also prevent other people from constructing their homes around the entrances of these tunnels. And by perpetuating these ideas of heathen myths or these heathen legends about these tunnels, which I'm sure the church is the one responsible for spreading, you also further deter people. Now let us return to Godred, for there is one more important point that I need to make about him. And that is this little interesting fact. The portrayal of Godred's takeover, in which a conqueror establishes his dynasty's dominance over the traditional rights of a native landholding populace, parallels the traditional medieval accounts of Harold Fairhair, who is remembered by medieval historians as the first king of Norway. See, this is very important because he is noted as the first king of Norway, and guess what? He died around the exact same time as Godred, or at least around the exact same time that Godred was taking over. So this tells us that there were several kings being established in several different parts of Europe around the exact same time, and they behaved in almost the exact same way.
Coincidence? I think not, especially since we know that one of them got their power base from a very suspicious group of islands that appears to have relations with ancient Egypt.